During Jesus' 3.5 year ministry, he cast out the money changers because they made his house a den of thieves. This judgment personifies how God executed judgment on the church in 1994 in the lead up to the end of the world, when the unsaved will attempt to hide from the wrath of God in the dens. Let us begin our examination of the den of thieves verses in Mark chapter 11 verse 13. And seeing a fig tree afar off, he came, if happily he might find anything thereon. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for the time of figs was not yet. And Jesus answered and said unto it, No man eat fruit upon thee hereafter forever. And his disciples heard it. And they came to Jerusalem, and Jesus went into the temple, and began to cast out them that sold and bought in the temple, and overthrew the tables of the money changers, and the seats of them that sold doves. Verse 17. And he taught, saying unto them, Is it not written, My house shall be called of all nations the house of prayer? But ye have made it a den of thieves. There are two important lessons that we learn about this passage. The first being the fig tree. According to Matthew chapter 24 verse 32, the fig tree is used as a sign of Christ's coming at the end of the world. But what about buying and selling? We know from Revelation chapter 13 that buying and selling involves the worship of the image of the beast. In verse 15 we read that those who refused to worship the image of the beast would be killed. And in verse 17 we read about buying and selling. And that no man might buy or sell, save that he had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. In verse 14 we see that the worship of the image of the beast involves miracles, such as speaking in tongues, falling backwards, dreams and visions, which are of Satan, who comes as an angel of light to deceive the congregations. The image itself reminds us that Israel was deceived by worshiping the images of Baal. And these images, according to Revelation chapter 9 verse 20, mean that we're trusting in the works of our own hands to become saved. In this regard, many in the church believe that they are saved by accepting Jesus or being baptized in water. But in God's eyes, these things are akin to the worship of idols or the worship of devils, that is, the image of the beast. This truth is made clear to us when we consider the fact that Mark chapter 11, where Jesus spoke about the den of thieves, is a quote from the Old Testament, namely Jeremiah chapter 7. In this passage, God uses the den of thieves or the den of robbers in relation to the worship of the images of Baal. In verse 8 of Jeremiah chapter 7 we read, Behold, ye trust in lying words that cannot profit. Will ye steal, murder, and commit adultery, and swear falsely, and burn incense unto Baal, and walk after other gods whom ye know not? And come and stand before me in this house, which is called by my name, and say, We are delivered to do all these abominations. Is this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers? That is, a den of thieves, as we read in Mark chapter 11. This is the passage that Jesus is quoting in the New Testament, because he wants us to understand that when he is casting out the den of thieves or the den of robbers, it is because they are trusting in lying words and committing spiritual adultery by worshiping the images of Baal. Like unto the New Testament church, which worships the image of the beast by teaching that we can become saved by our own works. But in Mark chapter 11 and Matthew chapter 21, we saw that God executed this judgment in the context of cursing the fig tree. And so we would expect to find something about that fig tree in the context of Jeremiah chapter 7. And we are not surprised to find that in chapter 8, God continues the theme about those abominations by referring to a fig tree that did not produce fruit. In verse 12, we read about the abominations. Were they ashamed when they committed abomination? Nay, they were not ashamed, neither could they blush. And in verse 13, we read about the fig tree. I will surely consume them, saith the Lord. There shall be no grapes on the vine, nor figs on the fig tree, and the leaf shall fade. Here, God is informing us that this fig tree did not produce fruit because of the abominations that involved the worship of Baal, meaning Israel was teaching lies in the house of God. And in Hosea chapter 9, verse 10, God expressly relates Israel to the fig tree and her worship of Baal. I found Israel like grapes in the wilderness. I saw her fathers as the first ripe in a fig tree at her first time. But they went after Baal Peor, and separated themselves unto their shame, and their abominations were according to as they loved. And so there is no question that Israel the fig tree did not produce fruit because she worshipped the images of Baal. And when we go back to Jeremiah chapter 8, we find in verse 19 and 20 that the worship of these graven images meant that Israel the fig tree would not produce fruit in summer. In verse 19 we read, Why have ye provoked me to anger with your graven images and with the strange vanities? The harvest is past, summer is ended, and we are not saved. This summer harvest, where Israel did not produce fruit, harkens back to the New Testament. Specifically, Matthew chapter 24, verse 32, and Luke chapter 21, verse 30, where we read that the fig tree did not produce fruit in summer. And so according to Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 20, summer was the time when the unsaved in the congregations will realize that they were not saved. And this brings us to the last two Den of Thieves verses. In Luke chapter 19, Jesus warns that because they made his house a den of thieves, there will not be one stone left upon another. Beginning in verse 43 of Luke chapter 19, we read, For the day shall come upon thee, that thine enemies shall cast a trench about thee, and compass thee round, and keep thee in on every side. And they shall lay even with the ground, and thy children with thee. And they shall not leave in thee one stone upon another, because thou knewest not the time of thy visitation. And in verse 45, God reminds us about the casting out of the money changers, who made God's house a den of thieves. And he went into the temple, and began to cast out them that sold therein, and them that bought, saying unto them, It is written, My house is an house of prayer, but ye have made it a den of thieves. Here, Jesus packs a great deal of information regarding the destruction of Israel. He reminds us of the time when the enemies of Israel, the Babylonians, surrounded Israel and eventually destroyed the temple in 587 BC. And Jesus used this imagery in Matthew chapter 24 to remind us that there will not be one stone left upon another when judgment comes near the end of the world. For instance, in Matthew chapter 24, verse 2, we read, And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and the end of the world? So there's no question that Jesus is using these Den of Thieves studies to teach us more about the time when he executes judgment on the church near the end of the world. In the first two Den of Thieves studies, Jesus wanted us to know that when he executes judgment on the church, we must consider the fact that this judgment caused the fig tree, which represents natural Israel's rebirth in 1948, to not produce fruit in summer, thereby signifying that those in the congregations involved in buying and selling, that is, worshiping the image of the beast, will not become saved. But here in Luke chapter 19, he wants us also to remember Matthew chapter 24, where Jesus promised that the destruction of the temple, without one stone upon another, is a sign of his coming at the end of the world. And when we go to the last Den of Thieves verse, in John chapter 2, God provides a timeline for the end. So we begin in John chapter 2, verse 13. And the Jews' Passover was at hand, and Jesus went to Jerusalem, and found in the temple those that sold oxen, and sheep, and doves, and the changers of money sitting. And when he had made a scourge of small cords, he drove them out of the temple, and the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers of money, and overthrew the tables, and said unto them that sold doves, Take these things hence. Make not my Father's house a house of merchandise. But then in verse 19 and 20, God provides a timeline for this destruction. Jesus answered and said unto them, Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Then said the Jews, 46 years was this temple in building, and wilt thou raise it up in 3 days? Now, since we know that the abomination of desolation was set up in the holy place in 1994, we might consider applying that 46 years between 1948, when the fig tree came in leaf, to the year 1994. And according to Daniel chapter 8, verse 14, God's people would endure this desolation for a period of 2,300 days. That is, from 1994 to the year 2000/2001, when God began to help us to see the abomination of desolation, and then proceed to cleanse our temples, that is, to remove the high places and the graven images that are identified with works gospels. And so it was during that time that many of God's elect began to leave the church. Okay, so we have one more verse that provides a relationship between the fig tree and the word den. In Revelation chapter 13, we read about this fig tree in relation to a time when the unsaved will know that judgment day has come and will attempt to hide from the wrath of God in dens. Beginning in Revelation chapter 6, verse 12, And I beheld when he had opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake. Now we know from Revelation chapter 11, verse 11, that this great earthquake strikes at a time when God raptures the two witnesses who represent God's elect. So there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth, and the moon became as blood. And the stars of heaven fell upon the earth, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs, when she is shaken of a mighty wind. So there's no question that this language is pointing to the end of the world, when the sun and the moon are darkened, and there's a great earthquake. And it was at that time that this fig tree produced untimely figs. And we know that this refers to summer, when the unsaved will know that they're not saved. Now God picks up this language about the fig trees being identified with stars in Isaiah chapter 34, where God is speaking about a time when all nations will be judged. In verse 2 of Isaiah chapter 34, we read, For the indignation of the Lord is upon all nations, and his fury upon all their armies. He hath utterly destroyed them, and hath delivered them to slaughter. Then skipping down to verse 4, we read about the fig tree. And all the host of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled together as a scroll, and all their hosts shall fall down, as a leaf falleth from the vine, and as a falling fig from the fig tree. This language is identical to what we read in Revelation chapter 6, in that the heavens departed as a scroll, and the figs fell like the stars. God is communicating to us that this is the time when all nations will face his wrath. The unsaved, namely those in the church, will attempt to hide themselves in the dens being places of worship, yet refusing to turn away from their works gospels. In that day, many will say, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in thy name, and in thy name cast out devils, and in thy name done many wonderful works? Then I will profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, ye that work iniquity. Additionally, Revelation 6 reveals that the unsaved will call for the mountains to fall on us. This language is found in Luke chapter 23 and Hosea chapter 10, where Jesus warned that the green tree of salvation would become dry or withered near the end, meaning that salvation is no longer possible for the children of the daughters of Jerusalem, that is, those in the church. Moreover, Hosea chapter 10 verse 9 teaches that those who worship images in the high places of Avon will produce thorns and thistles on the altar, meaning that those in the church will not follow a gospel that produces the fruits of salvation. God is making all of these pronouncements in the context of a fig tree that produced untimely figs. It is the same fig tree that is spoken of in Matthew chapter 24 that did not produce fruit in summer. It is also the same fig tree that withered when Jesus cast out the money changers who made God's house a den of thieves. Now, when we search the Bible to learn more about this time when this withering fig tree will be cut down, we come to Psalm chapter 90. And in that context, God is speaking about the destruction of man. And in verse 5, he typifies man as grass that is cut down and withered. There we read, Thou carriest them away as with a flood. They are as a sleep in the morning. They are like grass which groweth up. In the morning it flourisheth and groweth up, and in the evening it is cut down and withered. And in Joel chapter 1 verse 12, we see that that word withered is identified with the fig tree. The vine is dried up, and the fig tree languisheth. The pomegranate tree, the palm tree also, and the apple tree, even all the trees of the field are withered, because the joy is withered away from the sons of men. When we read about the fig tree and all the trees, we are reminded of Luke chapter 21, where God says that when the fig tree and all the trees shoot forth, ye know that summer is nigh, that is, the end of the world has come. Now, when we return to Psalm chapter 90, it would appear that God is giving us a timeline for when these withering trees will be cut down. In verse 9 of Psalm chapter 90, we read, For all our days are passed away in thy wrath. We spend our years as a tale that is told. The days of our years are 60 years and 10, that is 70 years. And if by reason of strength, they be 80 years, that is 80. Yet is their strength labor and sorrow, for it is soon cut off, and we fly away. Could it be that God is teaching us that that withering fig tree that came in leaf in 1948, that is National Israel, will be cut off 70 years from 1948 to the year 2018? Or is God revealing that it will be 80 years from 1948, taking us to 2028. Although these are very interesting timelines, we must admit that they are based on circumstantial evidence. But when we consider the doctrinal proofs that God is providing in relation to the fig tree and the casting out of the money changers who made God's house a den of thieves, we know that God is most certainly guiding us into truth. And as we learn more about God's judgment in relation to his salvation program, we will begin to understand the timeline of events. But in the meantime, God commands us to cleanse our temples by turning away from the works gospels of the church. And in the process, we will preach a gospel that emphasizes that our salvation is not based on our faith, but rather the faith of Christ, according to Galatians chapter 2, verse 16. Moreover, God informs us that we received grace in Christ before the foundation of the world. It was before the foundation of the world that God chose his elect, and that Christ, who is the Lamb of God, was slain from the foundation of the world, thus indicating that he paid for our sins even before he created the world.